2-liter bottle of water. Put a little bit of water in the bottom. Now try to balance it. And I couldn't because all the weight was really low. I couldn't maneuver it fast enough. Then he filled it all the way up. Now it was much heavier and it was much more unstable, but the center of gravity was higher. So yeah, I was totally able to balance it. The rocket's the same way. They're unstable, but you want them to be unstable in a particular kind of way. You want to be unstable in a way to where you can control it.
I'm an aerospace engineer by training. I went to Georgia Tech, got my master's degree there.
Now I spent 10 years working at NASA. This is the kind of community I was thinking of. It had all of the same needs as a community on Earth would have, but it had some very unique constraints.
He grew up talking space, living space. It is 4th grade state report on Alabama because of the Rocket Center, and even from our first date, I knew he was passionate about space.
Harrison Schmitt was the first trained geologist and only trained geologist to go to the moon. So he was a guy who knew what the heck to look for. And so the scientific take was so vast, it almost eclipses all the other missions put together.
During the Apollo era, you didn't need government programs trying to convince people that doing science and engineering was good for the country. It was self-evident. And even those not formally trained in technical fields embraced what those fields meant to the collective national future.
We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they're easy, but because they are hard.
Who wants to be an aerospace engineer so that you can design a plane that's a few % more fuel efficient? That doesn't really work. Saying, who wants to be an aerospace engineer because we need a plane that will navigate the rarefied atmosphere of Mars? You're going to attract the very best of those students. And the solutions to that problem, in every case I've ever seen, have improved life back here on Earth.
0 and liftoff of the Atlas V with Curiosity.
It had like heat shields and then a hypersonic drogue chute. I said this is not gonna work. Retro rockets and then a hoist. It was something Rube Goldberg would have designed. An SUV-sized rover was plunked down on Mars. How confident were you that this whole sequence of landing devices would work?
I wasn't confident at all. I was shitting bricks. It was scary. This lander has more than 10 times as much scientific instrumentation than anything we've sent to the surface of Mars. So it needs more power? Needs more power, as Kirk would say to Scotty. Well, the last one was solar. This one's got nukes.
Wait, so you have a nuclear power plant on the rover?
It's not a power plant. It's a power source. We're touchy about this, because when you use the nuclear word...
One of the two verboten N-words.
That's right. So when we use that N-word, we try to speak carefully. And it's not like a nuclear power plant with the cooling towers and the turbines and all that. It's a bunch of plutonium that's given off heat, and we use that to generate electricity.
So you found another thing to call it to not spook people when it's launched?
Yeah.
Okay.
Apollo astronauts used plutonium RTG to power their science equipment. The Mars rover Curiosity is entirely powered by RTG.
And it can run at night, it can run in any season, and it should be able to run...
the other ones had solar panels, they can only run in the daytime.
No.
Couldn't you charge a battery and keep working at night?
In the Martian winter, the amount of power goes down if your solar panels get covered with dust.
So the Martian winter, the sun is very low in the sky.
Yeah.
The Mars exploration rovers often found themselves short on power as dust settled on their solar panels.
They were the only source of energy, and the Martian winter was approaching.
The part of it that really breaks my heart is that we just didn't have power to drive anymore.
Well, one of them did die because of the winter, because it
One of the two rovers?
Yeah, if the power goes down enough so that you can't run the heaters at night, then you die. That already happened to one of our previous rovers. So if you want to do a lot of science, you want a lot of power, a lot of instrumentation, you want to last a long time and be able to rove anywhere on Mars.
And nukes.
Exploring space requires energy. Energy to run experiments. Energy to scrub carbon dioxide from astronauts' oxygen supply.
The carbon dioxide removal assembly is being worked on today inside the Destiny laboratory. A short was seen in one of the heating elements, but you see Mike Barrett there. He put a filter in there that helps keep the water pure. The system uses water because obviously water is made of hydrogen and oxygen. It uses electrolysis, which is passing an electrical current through that water to split the water into hydrogen and its oxygen. The hydrogen is dumped overboard. The oxygen is used to pump into the air of the station for the crew members to breathe.
You go to the moon and there's no oxygen atmosphere, there's no lakes of water or anything, so it really comes down to nuclear and solar power. They called it the N-word at NASA. They were saying, oh, we can't even talk about nuclear. And I said, how can we not talk about it? I mean, we have exactly two options for how to make power in space, and this is one of them, you know?
Europa! Another Europa! A black and white picture of a ring of Jupiter! Okay. No. What? How do... You didn't get a second.
Why is the Earth round? Why isn't it square or any other shape?
That's a good question. I like that question. It's a question I've asked myself. And the answer has to do with gravity.
Carl Sagan was a member of Voyager's imaging team. And it was his idea that Voyager take one last picture.
That's here. That's home. That's us. Every hero and coward, every creator and destroyer of civilization, every king and peasant, every young couple in love, every mother and father, hopeful child, inventor and explorer, every teacher of morals, every corrupt politician, every superstar, every supreme leader, every saint and sinner in the history of our species, on a mote of dust, suspended in a sunbeam.
As we explore further from the sun, the utility of solar panels shrink to zero. To illustrate, imagine we can power a space mission orbiting the Earth with one solar panel. We'll call this solar panel the Earth panel. If we use Earth panel orbiting Venus instead of the Earth, we'll get almost twice as much electricity from it. Because orbiting closer to the Sun, more photons will be hitting the panel's surface. The same Earth panel orbiting Mercury will generate almost 7 times as much electricity. Mercury is closer to the Sun, more photons hit the panel. But when we start moving away from the Sun, in Mars orbit, we only get half as much electricity. So to power an identical space mission, we now need 2 Earth panels. At Jupiter, where only 4% as many photons can hit Earth panel, we now need 27 Earth panels to power the mission. The distance between Earth and Sun is what's called an astronomical unit. Earth is 1 astronomical unit away from the Sun. Jupiter is only 5 astronomical units away from the Sun, but requires 27 times as many solar panels. The relationship is not linear, it's quadratic. At Saturn, 91 Earth panels. Uranus, Neptune. At Pluto, 1,500 Earth panels are required to power the mission. Somewhere between Mars and Saturn, our mission became impractical.
Clouds and haze completely hide the surface of Titan, Saturn's giant moon. Titan reminds me a little bit of home. Like Earth, it has an atmosphere that's mostly nitrogen, but it's 4 times denser.
NASA's Cassini mission to Saturn pulled into orbit, dropped off of itself, a little probe. The probe Huygens descended down from the Cassini spacecraft and landed on Titan.
Hidden beneath lies a weirdly familiar landscape. Titan has lots of water, but all of it is frozen hard as rock. In fact, the landscape and mountains are made mainly of water ice. On Titan, the seas and the rain are made not of water, but of methane and ethane. On Earth, those molecules form natural gas. On frigid Titan, they're liquid. There might be creatures that inhale hydrogen instead of oxygen and exhale methane instead of carbon dioxide. They might use acetylene instead of sugar as an energy source. How could we find out if such creatures rule a hidden empire beneath the oil dark waves?
The probe Huygens landed in one spot. It's a big moon. It's one of 6 moons bigger than Pluto, by the way. What's the other side of the moon look like? The probe only had battery life for a couple of hours. We weren't there long enough to see how things change. Does it snow methane? So these long-time baseline questions can't be answered by 2 hours worth of data.
Cassini mission was launched in 1997, and Saturn is a long way away. It took 7 years to get there.
The Huygens probe launched from Cassini only operated 2 hours, but Cassini itself, powered by plutonium RTG, continues to study Saturn and her 62 moons. For how long can plutonium power a mission? How far from the Sun can we explore?
The Sun is constantly shooting out streams of charged particles in all directions. This solar wind blows a vast magnetic bubble. It pushes out against the thin gas of interstellar space. Beyond the outer planets, our heliosphere, there's a border where one ends and the other begins.
Turns out there was a massive eruption from the Sun which eventually reached Voyager 1 in April of 2013. It caused the plasma around Voyager to vibrate or oscillate. By measuring that sound wave, we could measure the density of the plasma in interstellar space, the space between the stars.
The Voyagers move about 40,000 miles an hour. They gave us our first close-up look at Jupiter's Great Red Spot, a hurricane 3 times the size of Earth.
We can now make out finer detail on Jupiter than the largest telescopes on Earth have ever obtained. The cloud patterns are distinctive and gorgeous. Its motion hypnotizes us.
4 days after the Voyager 1 encounter with Jupiter, I was looking at an optical navigation frame. It became very evident to me was an anomalous crescent in the upper left-hand corner just off the limb of Io, a volcanic plume, and in fact a volcanic eruption.
The Voyagers discovered the first active volcano on another world, on Jupiter's moon, Io. The Voyagers dared to fly across Saturn's rings and revealed that they were made of hundreds of thin bands of orbiting snowballs. Voyager successfully completed its mission of discovery to the outer planets, but its odyssey into the darkness was just beginning. 35 years after its launch, Voyager 1 became the first of our spacecraft to enter an uncharted realm. Until then, we didn't know where the interstellar ocean began.
Oh, hello, universe! This morning, the New Horizons spacecraft made the closest ever pass near Pluto after being launched almost a decade ago, back when NASA had the cash to do cool stuff like this. And wow, the pictures are unbelievable! After almost a century of near total mystery, we finally know what Pluto really looks like. And we have to wait over a year now for all the information to come in. It's like opening up a birthday present every day from now until the end of the next year. Who doesn't love atmospheric data for their birthday? If you're watching, honey, hint, hint.
And in 2019, New Horizons will start sucking up data once again as it passes by a Kuiper's Belt object at a distance from the Sun of 43 astronomical units. Compare the performance of Cassini, Voyagers, New Horizons, and the Curiosity Mars rover against solar and battery-powered exploration. The Mars rover Spirit froze to death thanks to dust on its solar panels. Huygens landed safely on the surface of Titan, but NASA only received 2 hours worth of data. And most recently, the European Space Agency's 2014 achievement of landing a solar-powered probe named Philae on Comet 67P. Humanity landed a probe on a comet whose path spans both Earth's orbit and Jupiter's. Every 6 years, 67P nears the Sun, warms up, and ejects material from its core through vents on its surface. Every 6 years, 67P freezes once again as it drifts out towards Jupiter. Solar-powered Philae was never designed to survive a full orbit. But inner orbit study, an appropriate challenge for solar panels, hit a snag.
The landing produced some surprises. Philae didn't secure itself to the comet's surface and bounced, making multiple touchdowns. The final resting site was partly in shadow, receiving less sunlight to recharge its instruments.
Philae was power-starved and unable to conduct experiments before freezing to death. Hours of operation? Decades of operation. Neil deGrasse Tyson is a tireless advocate for NASA, explaining to politicians and public what we miss when space exploration is severely financially constrained.
We lost an entire generation of these smart people. They became like investment bankers or lawyers out of the 1980s and 90s because there's no place for them to take their interest in science.
When the merger between Boeing and Lockheed's business occurred, the merger promised in the press release $150 million of savings. Instead, there were billions of dollars of cost overruns.
And entrepreneur Elon Musk explains how space exploration is launch constrained. Musk created SpaceX to drastically reduce the cost of launching payload into orbit.
SpaceX was founded to make radical improvements to space transport technology, with particular regard to reliability, safety, and affordability.
We have top men working on it right now. Who? Top men.
But what about powering space exploration? Most of our RTG fuel, the plutonium-238, was created a quarter century ago. NASA started producing more in 2013, but the worldwide shortage of RTG fuel is a perpetual constraint on space missions. And while our tiny supply of plutonium-238 can power exploration missions lasting decades anywhere in our solar system, the radioactive decay of plutonium really does not provide much power. Curiosity runs on 100 watts, rolling across the surface of Mars, taking photos, grinding samples, detecting neutrons, monitoring the atmosphere, and sending all this data back to us. Curiosity does all this on 2 incandescent light bulbs worth of power. Our space missions will never match what we see in movies or read about in science fiction novels. This is an invisible constraint. The Martian is based on Mars Direct, a research paper written by NASA engineers.
But the weight of the rocket fuel required for a round trip to Mars was so enormous it would render the launch ship impossibly heavy.
We'd split the mission up into 2 parts, and we'd send the return vehicle out first with its own return propellant plant. So the propellant would be made on Mars.
Before any humans land on the planet, Mars Direct uses a small unmanned nuclear reactor on wheels to power the creation of rocket fuel. so that humans can get from the surface of Mars back up into space.
It is 6:53 on Sol 19, and I'm alive, obviously, but I'm guessing that's going to come as a surprise to my crewmates.
That a starving astronaut's journey across Mars consists of repeatedly deploying solar panels, sleeping during the day while his vehicle recharges, and then driving at night is a realistic but unnecessary challenge created for dramatic tension. Had Mark Watney been abandoned during a Mars Direct mission, he'd have ample electricity to journey across Mars thanks to the small nuclear reactor on wheels he could tow behind his rover.
Okay, it's not a giant nuclear power plant that powers a city. It's just a nice little putt-putt nuke sitting in the back of a truck.
Look, I don't mean to sound arrogant or anything, but I am the greatest botanist on this planet.
Similarly, Mark Watney rations his potato crop to survive 400 days on Mars.
I now have 400 healthy potato plants. I dug them up, being careful to leave their plants alive. The smaller ones I'll reseed, the larger ones are my food supply.
The carbon in Watney's potato crop tissue does not come from nutrient-rich astronaut poop. It comes from the carbon in the Martian atmosphere. Photosynthesis is carbon dioxide plus photons creating plant tissue and emitting oxygen. Because there's no shortage of carbon or water on Mars, more photons means more potato. Artificial lighting means bigger potatoes than could otherwise be grown in Mars orbit. It's the difference between 1/2 of Earth's sunlight and as many photons as the potato crop can absorb.
Hey, watch him.
Oh my God, El Dorado. The legends are true.
That is how illegal grow operations are routinely busted, simply by monitoring unusual behavior on the electrical grid. This is also why high-yield urban farming requires so much energy.
You want to see what minimal calorie count looks like?
It has been 7 days since I ran out of ketchup.
Andy Weir put his astronaut on the brink of freezing to death and starving to death by downgrading the Mars Direct nuclear reactor to an RTG. Even so, nuclear power of some sort was still required, as the author explains.
At one point I considered, when he's on his long drive to Schiaparelli, I thought, what if the RTG develops a problem? What if it leaks or something like that and he has to live without it? And so he throws it away and he has to drive away without it. And there's just no way you survive. It's really? You are dead.
When you see a futuristic and inspiring space mission on the big screen, it's not being powered by RTG or solar. Well, what if NASA missions had access to far more energy? Most people don't appreciate how little energy NASA has at their disposal to design missions around. The most exciting missions are not even under consideration because we have no way to power them.
We got one liquid water planet in our solar system, and we've already identified 3 potential hydrospheres that are ice covered and far, far from the sun.
Right.
But based on our own immediate experience, it's a 3-to-1 ratio.
Sure. Do we know if any of them are habitable?
We don't, but we got to go look.
A mission to explore under the ice of Europa would be the ultimate robotic challenge.
Solar is out of the question. Jupiter is too far from the sun, and batteries can't hold enough power to melt through a planet's outer shell of ice. We need something small, lightweight, long-lasting, and extremely energy-dense to power such a mission.
Can I just give my favorite mission, which doesn't exist and isn't funded now? It would be to go to Jupiter's moon, Europa, which has an icy outer surface. The gravitational stress on Europa from Jupiter and other surrounding moons is pumping energy into it, much the same way when you warm up a racquetball by hitting it. You distort it, it bounces back to shape, you're pumping energy into it. That has melted the interior ice. It has had an ocean of liquid water that's been liquid for billions of years. And every place on Earth we find liquid water, we have found life. I want to go ice fishing on Europa. Lower submersible.
Aerospace is freaking cool, man. It's awesome to work on rockets and spaceships and everything. I love it. It's like in my guts. I love it.
If you want to build a ship, don't drum up people to collect wood, but rather teach them to long for the endless immensity of the sea.
This was O'Neill's vision back in the 70s. We all knew we needed energy, and solar energy sure seemed great. This really affected the way I thought. I was like, yeah, sign me up for this.
There's no coal on the moon, there's no petroleum, there's no wind either. And solar power had a real problem.
I worked a lot of my career in solar power systems. It's just that said, I'm a lot more aware of their limitations.
The moon orbits the Earth once a month. For 2 weeks, the sun goes down and your solar panels don't make any energy.
I knew Kirk Sorensen as a young engineer.
I ended up getting a job at Marshall Space Flight Center at NASA.
Dating back to NASA days when we were looking for deep space power systems out there for Mars and the moon. And all the systems we had were just not going to make it.
This is Mark Watney, astronaut, here on the Hermes.
You basically point the bird in that direction, you wait 150 days, and 36 million miles later, we should be at Mars.
Ion engines are real technology. They're not just invented for the book. Basically, they're particle accelerators that shoot particles very, very fast. So fast that the particles gain relativistic mass. Wow. With less matter, you're getting more momentum change. So you need very, very little mass. All the technology that you see in the book actually exists. However, some of it is better than our current incarnations. So we don't have ion engines anywhere near as powerful as Hermes has, but there's nothing preventing us from making it. We know how to do that.
Right.
We could scale it up. And everything you do in space, because you don't have any ground or air or anything to push against, it all comes down to delta V to put yourself on a Mars intercept. You need a delta V of about 2.5 kilometers a second, which is about 5,000 miles an hour. You can't cheat the system in any way. Physics demands that you pay the price. And the amount of fuel you have on your ship determines the total amount of delta V you can have, period. And you need a lot of energy to do that, so you'd need a reactor aboard, which my fictional ship has.
There were a lot of people who were saying, let's put solar arrays out on Mars. Well, Mars has terrible dust storms. I said, if you were on Mars and you had these solar arrays and they got coated by dust, you're gonna die.
Take a look.
Dust storm.
Headed straight for Mars 1 base camp.
Southern hemisphere coming from the east.
These bad boys can cover a whole planet, last up to a year.
Because now this time I was not particularly excited about nuclear. I thought nuclear, isn't that kind of bad or dirty or yucky? I just had this sort of vague distaste for nuclear.
Almost all of the nuclear power we use on Earth today uses water as a basic coolant. At normal pressures, water will boil at 100 degrees Celsius. This isn't nearly hot enough to generate electricity effectively. So water-cooled reactors have to run at much higher pressures than atmospheric pressure. And this means that you have to build a water-cooled reactor as a pressure vessel. If that sounds heavy, that's because it is.
We were looking at a nuclear reactor, and they tend to be heavy, and you need to have a large amount of shielding.
My dad worked on the SNAP reactor for NASA.
Did he really?
Yeah. And what my dad did was he shook the shit out of it, and then they would see what broke, and then they would fix it, shake it again, see what broke, shake it, and then they ran it for 1,000 hours, and then up powered, down powered. They were going to put it in a Saturn V rocket. Yep, exactly. Send it to the moon. They never did that. Send it to the space base that they never built. Put it onto Mars, and they never did that program.
It's a shame. We presented this at the Nuclear and Emerging Technologies for Space conference to accommodate space travel or off-world living. That brings in a whole set of more robust variables that need to be attended to.
Nuclear reactors in space, like you just said, they are under such extreme conditions. The shuddering of the rocket as it's going up into space. I mean, there's G-forces, the vibrational problems.
But mass is everything in space, and so if you can have a much lighter reactor, let's do it. Well, your choices are limited. You're not going to make a light water reactor that's, you need this really thick pressure vessel.
Let me diss on water a few more times. It's a covalently bonded substance. The oxygen has a covalent bond with two hydrogens. Well, neither one of those bonds is strong enough to survive getting smacked around by a gamma or a neutron. And sure enough, they knock the hydrogens clean off. Now, in a water-cooled reactor, you have a system called a recombiner that will take the hydrogen gas and the oxygen gas that is always being created from the nuclear reaction and put them back together. It's a great system as long as it's operating and the system is pumping. Well, at Fukushima Daiichi, the problem is the pumping power stopped.
At high temperature, H2O can also react with the cladding to release hydrogen, or damage the cladding, releasing radioactive isotopes. These two accidents illustrate the need for a coolant, which is more chemically stable than H2O.
In a community on the moon, we would live very, very close to your power source. This isn't something that's going to be far away, and if the power source were to fail, you're going to die really quickly. So I thought, if I was on the moon and I was totally dependent on a power source, I'd want one that I would just about feel comfortable living right on top of.
3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima were all radically different incidents. But what all three had in common was how poorly water performed as a coolant when things started to go wrong.
Steam takes up about 1,000 times more volume than liquid water. If you have liquid water at 300 degrees Celsius and suddenly you depressurize it, it doesn't stay liquid for very long. It flashes into steam.
That's a scuba tank, hot scuba tank, full of nuclear material.
At 3 Mile Island, water couldn't be pumped into the core because some of the coolant water had vaporized into steam. The increased pressure forced coolant water back out, contributing to a partial meltdown. At Chernobyl, the insertion of poorly designed control rods caused core temperature to skyrocket. The boiling point of the pressurized water coolant was passed, and it flashed to steam. It was a steam explosion that tore the 2,000-ton lid off the reactor casing and shot it up through the roof of the building. At Fukushima, loss of pump power allowed coolant water to get hotter and hotter until it boiled away. These three accidents illustrate the need for a coolant with a higher boiling point than water.
When you put water under extreme pressure, like anything else, it wants to get out of that extreme pressure. Almost all of the aspects of our nuclear reactors today that we find the most challenging can be traced back to the need to have pressurized water. Water-cooled reactors have another additional challenge. They need to be near large bodies of water where the steam they generate can be cooled and condensed. Otherwise, they can't generate electrical power. Now, there's no lakes or rivers on the moon. So if all of this makes it sound like water-cooled reactors aren't such a good fit for a lunar community, I would tend to agree with you. You see, I had the good fortune to learn about a different form of nuclear power that doesn't have all these problems for a very simple reason. It's not based on water cooling, and it doesn't use solid fuel. Surprisingly, it's based on salt.
Science allows you to look at everyday objects for what they really are, chemically and physically. And it really makes you look twice at the world around you. Your table salt is frozen. That's a really strange thing to think about. Your table salt on your kitchen table is frozen.
But once they melt, they have 1,000 degrees C of liquid range. And they have excellent heat transfer properties. They can carry a lot of heat per unit volume, just like water. Water actually is really good from a heat transfer perspective. It's good at carrying heat per unit volume. Salts are just as good at carrying heat per unit volume, but salts don't have to be pressurized. And that, if you remember nothing else of what I say tonight, remember that one fact. A nuclear reactor is a rough place for normal matter. The nice thing about a salt is it's formed from a positive ion and a negative ion, like sodium's positively charged and chlorine's negatively charged, and they go, we're not really going to bond, we're just going to kind of associate one with another, you know? And that's what's called an ionic bond. Yeah, you're kind of friends, you know, you're...
Facebook friends.
Facebook friends. All right, well, it turns out this is a really good thing for a reactor because a reactor is going to take those guys and just smack them all over the place with gammas and neutrons and everything. And the good news is they don't really care who they particularly are next to. As long as there's an equal number of positive ions and negative ions, the big picture is happy. A salt is composed of the stuff that's in this column, the halogens, and the stuff that's in these columns, the alkalis and the alkaline earths. Fluorine is so reactive with everything, but once it's made a salt, a fluoride, then it's incredibly chemically stable and non-reactive.
Sodium chloride, table salt, or potassium iodide, they have really high melting points. And we like the lower melting points of fluoride salts.
Sometimes people go, oh, you're working on liquid fluorine reactors. No, I am not working on liquid fluorine reactors. We're working on fluoride reactors, and there's a big difference between those two. One is going to explode, the other one is like super duper stable.
I see moving to molten salt fueled reactor technology as a way to get rid of all the stored energy term problems that we look at in today's reactors, whether it's pressure, whether it's chemical reactivity, even the potential of fission products in the fuel itself to be released. Those fission products are bound up very tightly in salts. Strontium and cesium are both bound up in very, very stable fluoride salts. Cesium fluoride, very stable salt. Strontium bifluoride, another very stable salt. In light water reactors, cesium is volatile in the chemical state of the oxide fuel of a light water reactor. And that's been one of the concerns about cesium release. Cesium would not release from a fluoride reactor at all.
I actually met Kirk at a conference in Manchester in the UK as part of an event put on by the Guardian newspaper.
Hi, I'm Kirk Sorensen.
They'd invited people to come and present their ideas, and Kirk was one of the 10 people that presented. And I can remember sitting on the panel and just being kind of blown away by the fact that there was an alternative version of nuclear.
I'm an environmentalist. My passion is kind of climate change and energy.
I worked at Friends of the Earth, a green campaign group in the UK, and I was an anti-nuclear campaigner.
But I've become a politician.
I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth.
That's changed my life quite a lot, so I'm still getting used to it, really. People call me my lady and the Baroness.
Sellafield Limited is actively working with the 600 people who are going to be losing their jobs at this time, and everybody in the area is doing their very best to see if these people can find jobs very quickly.
Sellafield is a unique site in the UK, and I believe it could become the home of world-leading research into the use of next-generation nuclear reactors. Such reactors, as well as being more efficient in their fuel use, generating no long-lasting waste, can be designed to burn up existing stockpiles of plutonium held at the Sellafield site.
Despite greater acceptance of nuclear power, there remain concerns about nuclear waste.
So, in light of this, is there more that the government can do to support R&D into new nuclear designs that will help to ensure we develop the safest and most efficient new reactors?
The engineer looks at the world as hundreds of things that are inefficient and should be more properly designed. So when you tell an engineer that something's like 20% more efficient, it's like, yeah. You tell them it's like 50% more efficient, like, oh my gosh. Now imagine when you tell them it's hundreds of times more efficient. It becomes absolutely irresistible. Making solid nuclear fuel is a complicated and expensive process. And we extract less than 1% of the energy from the nuclear fuel before it can no longer remain in the reactor. The solid fuel will begin to swell and crack, and you begin to get this central void. This is actually a gap in the fuel. When the fuel swells to a certain point, the clad can't hold it anymore. And when the clad can't hold it anymore, it's time to remove the fuel from the reactor. At this point, only a small amount of the energy has been consumed. Wigner didn't like solid fuel. He was a chemical engineer by training, and he thought, what process do we run chemically based on solids? We don't. Everything we do, we use as liquids or gases because we can mix them completely. You can take a liquid, you can fully mix it. You can take a gas, you can fully mix it. You can't take a solid and fully mix it unless you turn it into a liquid or a gas. I believe part of this came from Wigner's educational background.
He was the only person, or almost the only person, who combined great skill as a nuclear physicist with great skill as an engineer. Wigner, of course, was a chemical engineer by training. He was the only one who commanded both of those attributes. And so he was able to see both the engineering and physics aspects.
He was a chemical engineer by training, and he knew that in chemical processes, the reactant streams are almost always liquids and gases. They're fluids. And in fluids, a completion of the various chemical reactions are possible. He looked at the nuclear problem and wondered if the same principle might not apply. And they began investigating some very, very radical nuclear reactors, totally different than the kind of stuff we have now. Wigner was not terribly successful in making converts in the nuclear community.
But he did make one convert, this guy, Alvin Weinberg. He was his student during the Manhattan Project. And Weinberg got it. He got the big picture. We need liquid fuel. I see it. I see what we got to do. They were into small modular reactors before small modular reactors were cool.
Small, liquid, poor, and then you have high efficiency. So there's a couple of things that jumped right out at us. The shielding weight became reasonable.
All these great benefits, how do we know this can work? Quite simply because we did it. I got in the car, I live in Alabama, and I was able to go up to Oak Ridge and talk to some of the people there. And I said, hey, I've heard that you guys a long time ago did this really, really cool thing.
In the 1960s at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, we ran what was called the Molten Salt Reactor experiment.
This was the main focus of Oak Ridge for decades, and it was very abruptly cut off, and it was a very bitter pill to swallow for them. And so a lot of these great minds, they thought their life work had kind of gone to waste.
Yeah. Long time ago, we did a really, really cool thing, and everybody who did it's retired or dead now. I'm like, oh, well, that's not good.
At the world's oldest molten salt website. If you find the original copy of the Generation 4 report, my URL for my website is listed as the only reference. I'm a guy in a garage. I should not be the only reference for this. The other thing is Alvin Weinberg wasn't dead yet. To list me, wow, there's so many other documents. Are you kidding me?
I actually got an email from a guy named Richard Weinberg, who is the son of Alvin Weinberg. Well, are your father's papers somewhere? Have they been, examined? And he said, most of my father's papers are at the Oak Ridge Children's Museum. And so I ended up going back to Oak Ridge. Literally, there was a big walk-in closet with filing cabinets stacked to the ceiling that nobody had looked at in decades, probably.
I'm realizing as I go through these Oak Ridge documents how limited their distribution was. On the very last page of every one, there's a distribution. There's about 40 people. And you're like, so best case scenario, 40 people read what I'm holding in my hand 50 years ago.
And this is no little thing. This was a long research project starting from the 50s, a huge body of research Oak Ridge did. Unfortunately, only Oak Ridge, so it's geographically limited knowledge. There's hundreds of these big, thick documents.
One time, this whole courtyard would have been full of thousands of specimens, so we could do all kinds of research and testing on it.
Right.
He said, but one day, nickel alloys were at a real premium, like unheard of recycle values. And he said someone made the decision to come in. He said they cleaned out all of our lab specimens for recycle.
Yuri Gatt, a scientist at Oak Ridge, got me involved in molten salt. Walking through graphite reactor building, and there's this large pallet covered with books, manuals. And we kind of stopped. It was kind of in the way of our path. And there was Yuri was there. He goes, oh, they didn't tell me again. And I just reached down, picked them up. They were all big, thick documents on the molten salt reactor. And I happened to pick two of the best I possibly could. The status report of the molten salt breeder reactor. The other was the project plan. I just randomly picked them up. And the workman came, he said, hey, what are you doing here? And Yuri says, what's going to happen to these documents? The guy goes, they're going to, these are the excess, they're going to the burn facility. They were burning them.
It was a real shame probably in the 1990s that just needing more space and that so many documents started to be just destroyed or shredded.
Hey, this would be great for a space reactor. We ought to throw some money at these guys and get all this stuff documented.
NASA was able to get Oak Ridge and like $10,000 to scan in those documents. A really genuinely beautiful thing to try and share knowledge.
There was never a level of uptake for it at the agency, but amongst individuals, there were a lot of people that got very interested.
And we had dug up that information from Oak Ridge National Labs and thought it was great and kind of put together several proposals based on it.
It's been a lot better. A new policy is any old documents, if someone in the world is calling them, that makes it important enough to scan. And as we need them, they seem ready to be able to make electronic versions that the rest of the world can use.
We have been able to access and also to disperse an amazing amount of information.
This was the big problem, was how do you show this is real? It sounds like made up technology when you describe it to people.
Geez, the molten salt reactors that pretty much does what fusion is asking, and we're almost developed to the stage we could start using them so long ago in the 50s, 60s, and early 70s.
You nuclear engineers are probably going to think those are fuel rods. They're not. They're graphite. The fuel was a liquid that flowed through channels in this graphite. So the graphite served as the function that water serves in an existing solid-fueled reactor, which is to moderate the neutrons that are being born in fission. Except this time, instead of having solid fuel and a liquid moderator, you've got liquid fuel and a solid moderator.
It's so opposite. They have solid fuel, liquid moderator. Molten salt, liquid fuel, solid moderator. Water, salt. Graphite, no graphite in here. Metal in here, yeah, no metal in here. It's like an opposite reactor.
Well, back around 2004, a gentleman named Kirk Sorensen had contacted me by email and came to visit us at Berkeley because we'd been working on molten salt reactor technology and doing some of the early studies of how salts might be used to cool solid-fueled reactors. And Kirk came into my office. He had a stack of CD-ROMs, and on them was this compendium of reports from Oak Ridge National Laboratory from the molten salt reactor program of the 1950s through 1970s. And that was a treasure trove. There was an enormous amount of very useful data.
That he discovered a treasure trove. This was going to change the world.
When I was at NASA, I finagled some funds to get those documents scanned. I made bunches and bunches of copies of CDs. For all you young people, this is almost like kind of pre-internet. Yeah, we had it, but your website would hold about 20 megabytes. So CDs were the only way to really move around big data. SneakerNet was probably the better way to describe it. So I made these for the Secretary of Energy and delivered them in DC, and I sent them to lab directors.
Sent it all out to these different places, just sure that, they were going to get CDs from a random person and put them in their computer and study them extensively, all 5 gigabytes of them, and come to the same conclusion I had and change national policy. I mean, of course, right?
Nobody cared at all. The only person who cared was Per. And I'm really, really glad he did, because I think he feels the same way about this technology that I do, that it's really exciting.
I mean, I spent a number of years when I first learned about this just asking people, okay, tell me what's wrong with this. Tell me why it's not the greatest thing since sliced bread, because really, I wasn't a nuclear engineer back then. I didn't want to get involved if it wasn't important. And I wanted somebody to come and say, oh, yeah, we did this and this and this, and it totally did not work out, and that would have been simple. So I'd be like, okay, fine, I'll go back to doing my space things. But the fact that they didn't say that, and they said that this was a great idea, we really should have done it, that stuck in my craw for a long time. I would wonder, Joe Bonametti and I would talk to each other at NASA, and it almost tormented us. I think it really did literally torment Joe, that we weren't working on what we felt like was the most important thing.
It'd be a fantastic help to the human race in general. And it could be also what lends us quite well into space reactors and going to Mars, going to the moon and other places. You need that light, small power source.
We need water. We need to grow our food. The sustainability of long-term colonization of Mars is a very real option with the molten salt reactor.
Already we're pretty constrained in fresh water. We in California are experiencing this firsthand right now. And so another application of being able to have lots of energy is to be able to create fresh water from ocean water.
Every drop of drinking water on the planet is desalinated with nuclear power today. I think we should just use a little bit more. And everybody on the planet has all the fresh water they can drink. Put a power plant on the coast, bring in seawater from a couple miles out, desalinate it. Suddenly you're not even pulling water out of the aquifers anymore. So the river's not touched, the lake's not touched.
I must be missing something. These guys who are real nuclear engineers, they must know something about nuclear that will, if I knew it, then I would understand why we're not doing molten salt reactors. So
I need to go get my degree and get an understanding, and then I'll see whatever it is they see. Turns out everything I learned, everything I studied just made this look better and better. And these are kind of arcane reasons, but they're very important. Like one day I learned how the reactor would always homogenize its composition. That may not sound like a big deal, but to a reactor designer, that's a humongous deal. It is just absolutely of incredible performance. I'm sitting here thinking, you guys should build this machine. If you only picked one reason, it should be for that reason, because it would make it so much easier for you to design and operate the reactor. And I brought it up to my professor. He was talking about how the current reactors work. I said, well, did you realize this design would always have a homogeneous composition? He goes, I never thought about that.
From cyberspace, from Kirk Sorensen, who is with the NASA Marshall Space Flight Center. He would like for you to comment on the Molten Salt Reactor program.
The Molten Salt people, who included the most famous figures in nuclear energy, in particular Eugene Wigner, are all dying off. We don't have people building molten salt reactors now. The molten salt reactor experiment was one of the most important and I must say brilliant achievements of the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. And I hope that after I'm gone, people will look at the dusty books that were written on molten salts and will say, hey, these guys had a pretty good idea. Let's go back to it.
Once you learn something, you can't pretend you didn't learn it, and you can't pretend that you don't know what a powerful thing this is. And you can choose to do that, but that's not the moral choice to make, right? To ignore it, to pretend you didn't learn it. So the moral thing, the right thing to do is to just do what we're doing, which is, in my opinion, it's sort of the bare minimum.
Well, I've been in this energy game for about 10 years now, and no one's ever told me there was a safer, more sustainable form of nuclear. So I was kind of instantly interested, and I kept thinking about it occasionally. I kept in touch with Kirk a little bit, and then Fukushima happened.
This is great. I mean, this is just what I wanted to have happen, is her talking to these guys and getting that straightened up. Oh man, it's just perfect.
Nick Engel's probably the most knowledgeable person around these days, right?
I've never met Sid. I've read all his papers. I've actually extracted all the text from him, converted it all, rebuilt. I mean, I don't know if there's anybody that studied his stuff more than me. I was so tickled when I found out he was alive.
I mean, how did you feel about the reactor now? I mean, it sounds like it was quite a boring job in a way, but did you feel fondly towards this reactor design?
Oh yes. It wasn't at all boring.
I mean, boring in the sense that, it was kind of safe. And
it did exactly what we calculated it ought to do. And that's pretty satisfying.
Yeah. I think it would unleash a lot of human potential that's currently not being fully fulfilled. Standard of living does correlate quite well with access to energy.
Throughout her life, she had been heating water with firewood, and she had hand-washed laundry for 7 children. And now she was going to watch electricity do that work.
There's a great talk on TED by Hans Rosling, how women in the 50s, when they started to have washing machines, became suddenly hugely more productive.
To my grandmother, the washing machine was a miracle.
Washing clothes is a really unproductive task. It's just repetitive. You have to keep doing it. You're not creating anything that's sustaining anyone, really. It's just time wasted.
So 2 billion have access to washing machine, and the remaining 5 billion, how do they wash? How do most of the women in the world wash? They wash like this, by hand. It's a time-consuming labor, hours every week. And sometimes they also have to bring water from far away. And they want the washing machine. And there's nothing different in their wish than it was from my grandma 2 generations ago in Sweden. Water from the stream, heating with firewood, washing like that. They want the washing machine in exactly the same way. But environmentally concerned students tell me, no, everybody in the world cannot have cars and washing machines. How many of you doesn't use a car? And some of them proudly raise their hand, and say, I don't use a car. And then I put the really tough question. How many of you hand wash your jeans and your bed sheet? And no one raised their hand.
As soon as you could get a machine to do that for you, that time became time for the family. And he said that was when he sat down with his mum and started to learn to read with her. And that would happen, multiplied over. All these women suddenly have much more capacity for being more nurturing or being more productive. And it's a great empowerer to have energy and have machines do things for us that are just routine, rote tasks.
Huge fractions of the developing world, women spend all day looking for sources of water. And when they get to the water, it is typically filthy and parasites, disease, etc. I mean, if you could have clean water, disease and parasite-free water to homes, you would liberate an enormous amount of time. And you'd increase the health of the people.
There's a lot of things we just throw away because the energy to reuse them is more expensive than virgin material.
Dig it out of the ground, you turn it into something, you use it, you smash it, and then you throw it back in a pit in the ground. Ultimately, it just means you leave one big hole in the ground over here and then start filling up another hole over there. And is that sustainable? Perhaps there's more of a closed loop system that could be employed. And that's the dream, but that does require energy.
That was one of the things that always attracted me about the notion of exploring space, was that you had to implement that simply to survive. You know, if you were going to live on the moon or Mars, there was no pit over here and pit over there. You better figure out how to make it all stay. You know, every atom of nitrogen or oxygen or hydrogen became precious to you. And when I would tell people, why were we doing NASA? That was the most effective thing, was the whole idea of recycling and what we would learn from exploring space. What prevents us from doing that right now on Earth? I mean, why do we have to go to space to learn how to be really, really good recyclers? Why don't we recycle like that on Earth? It's energy, you know, energy has to be really, really cheap, or the penalty has to be really, really bad. Now in space, the penalty was really, really bad. If you didn't recycle, you ran out of air and water. But on the ground, to go achieve that dream of a closed loop, you need to have really, really cheap energy.
For example, in the copper mining space, when they extract the copper, they'll do a first pass and then leave it as a mound. And they'll wait until the price of copper goes high enough, but there's a price at which you can justify doing a second or even third or more passes, and it's all a function of what's the energy input and what's the market price. And when those reach parity, you can go in and justify more extraction. Well, the same is true with recycling these materials. If we can bring the cost of electricity down far enough, you could conceivably even go back and recycle landfills.
Appliances, we chop up old rail cars, demolish bridges, buildings, whatever. We load scrap into large haul trucks and they back up into this bucket and dump scrap inside.
That's dozens of cars.
Yeah, a lot of cars. So that bucket probably has 140 tons of scrap in it right now.
I told them if they thought anything gonna move to run behind you.
Yeah.
That's still the standard protocol.
That's right. I got Kevlar on.
All right, you guys do the same. We're all getting behind you.
So you've been able to drop your power consumption per ton almost about a third, it looks like.
Probably since the mid-early 80s.
So besides your scrap material input, what's your next largest cost on production?
Electricity.
Electricity.
Of your water use, we're evaporatively cooling, and we use about 2.5 million gallons a day, so we're a pretty big water user, which is about 1/10 of what the paper mills use.
But you can get far more cycles on recycling steel or aluminum than you could out of paper or plastic.
Oh, sure. Yeah, actually, it's debatable whether paper recycling is even that great a pursuit. In some cases, it's mandated, but this is one where economics drives the recycling.
But the steel industry is probably one of the better models of recycling.
Aluminum, too, would be. There's less given over to waste.
If we could make energy cheap enough, there's a lot of other products you could make economic to recycle.
Absolutely.
It's easy to forget about that in our world here on Earth because we're so abstracted from our energy sources. Food is at the grocery store, and that we flush the toilet and the waste goes somewhere where somebody takes care of them. And we don't really think about the flow of energy that makes all of this possible.
With the energy generated, we can actually recycle all of the air, water, and waste products within the lunar community. In fact, doing so would be an absolute requirement for success. We could grow the crops needed to feed the members of the community even during the 2-week lunar night using light and power from the reactor.
it kind of was this microcosm that made it easier for me to understand the bigger picture that we do have going on here on Earth and how we can make that bigger picture better, how we can enhance our quality of life on Earth.
When I think of our golden era of space exploration, the late 1950s, right on up through the early 1970s, over that time, very few weeks would go by before there would be an article in a magazine where a cover story would extol the city of tomorrow.
I mean, why wouldn't we want a community of the future to be self-sustaining and energy independent? The same energy generation and recycling techniques that can have a powerful impact on surviving on the moon could also have a powerful impact on surviving on the Earth.
And people love that. They think you're naive to be optimistic, that we are going to make the future better than the past. We are going to figure out our problems, and we're going to get past them.
What's your project?
My project's on reducing carbon emissions, and I chose to do so with nuclear. And I talk a bit on the oil sands, on how nuclear can help, for example, generating the steam for SAGD. People were mostly interested in the lifter, talking about the thorium. They like that better as an alternative because uranium really has a bad rap.
Oh, has it directed you in your life in terms of...
I want to be a nuclear physicist.
You do, right?
Yeah.
I was going to be a music teacher. I had my heart set on it. That's what I went to school for, music education. When I heard about thorium, and I just thought to myself, okay, music, it's great, I love it, but it's just insignificant to the challenges that the human race is experiencing.
Because of my former experience as a reactor operator for the U.S. Navy, I got it. I understood it right away.
I made a 2-minute video for a science video competition.
In the 1950s, Alvin Weinberg, director of Oak Ridge National Labs, was tasked with building a nuclear reactor. Today we learned we can run this type of reactor on thorium.
I've been trying to get people in my generation to do the good stuff that needs to happen on energy issues for 30 years.
The title of my talk is Thorium and Molten Salt Reactors, Improving Public Knowledge and Awareness.
With us being in chemical engineering, we have a background in liquid-liquid extraction.
The fission products are more soluble in the bismuth stream than in the salt stream, so they will be transferred when they contact.
It was nice to finally have a technical audience.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
It's going to be up to you guys, like you high school students and you college people, to pull us out, so you can do good for my grandkids and everything. And you know what? They get it. They know it.
I didn't grow up around, we got to fight the Russians, we got to fight the communists,
You don't have that searing image of a mushroom cloud in your head, probably.
No, absolutely not. I really want to work on lifter, I really want to work on thorium technology.
I know everybody I talk to about this technology, we're all engineers, so we're kind of geeky that way. But everybody's super excited about the potential in here because it's really quite cool.
We're going to try and get a teacher in every single school to teach molten salt chemistry and molten salt class.
I'd love to see y'all here, but it's for me. It's for me and it's for my children, and I'd love to see more companies coming up with codes, coming up with reactor designs, and I would love to jump on board. My desire when I was a younger man was to get involved in alternative energy. I hadn't really seen anything about thorium or molten salt reactors at all, and that TED Talk was the one where Kirk was in town talking about lifters.
Thorium has an electromagnetic signature that makes it easy to find even from a spacecraft. Here's an actual map of where the lunar thorium is located.
When I pitched this story to Wired magazine, there's 6 editors around a table, and they're pretty well-informed science and technology journalists, and not a single one of them had heard of thorium.
We were working on nuclear engines, we were working on really far out stuff. In this buddy of mine's office, he got a book on his shelf, and the book was called Fluid Fuel Reactors. He used to work at Oak Ridge National Labs in Tennessee, and he said, I just went to the library and I got this old book. It was written in 1958. I've been meaning to look through it. And I said, well, hey, can I borrow this book? Big old thick book. It was like 1,000 pages. Oh boy, I mean, whew. But it was intriguing enough to me, and it seemed really different than the kind of nuclear energy we had now. And they also mentioned in this book a lot about thorium. Thorium. I was like, dude, what the heck is thorium?
Thorium is a naturally occurring radioactive substance found just about everywhere on this planet. We have lots and lots of thorium, and it has some unique properties. One of them is,
if you hit thorium with a neutron, the thorium will absorb the neutron, and it will turn from thorium-232 into thorium-233. It's going to decay into protactinium-233, and then it will decay over about a month to uranium-233. Uranium-233, if you hit it with a neutron, it will fission. In addition to releasing all that energy, it will release 2 or 3 additional neutrons. All right, so you need one of those neutrons to go find another thorium, and you need another one of those neutrons to find another uranium-233 to continue the reaction. You're fissioning uranium-233, but you're making a new one. You can almost think about it as a pseudo-catalyst. If you had some uranium-233, you could catalyze the burning of thorium indefinitely. When Shippingport was shut down for the last time in 1982, the examination showed that there was more fissile material, more uranium-233 in the fuel than there was when they started. Thorium breeding worked. It was actually done and demonstrated. Not in a molten salt reactor, but in a light water reactor.
Well, you're really coupling 2 different technologies as far as history proving them out. You have Shippingport that proved the thorium fuel cycle, and then you have molten salt reactors that proved the liquid fuel form.
The Oak Ridge plan was to couple. I mean, they designed the MSRE for a thorium fuel cycle.
It was their design.
It didn't do it.
Plan, but they never got there.
They never got there, but it was. I mean, it wasn't like somebody said, "Oh, gee, let's put thorium in MSR." Never thought of that before.
Today's reactors are fueled by a rare isotope of uranium, uranium-235. To fuel a reactor with abundant material is called breeding. Breeder reactors take naturally common isotopes and turn them into man-made isotopes that can be split apart to release energy. Shippingport was a breeder which used pressurized water as a coolant. To combine pressurized water with the breeding of nuclear fuel is a particularly expensive approach. With breeder reactors, coolant choice greatly impacts the cost of operation, even more so than with inefficient non-breeders.
The real object of this reactor is to learn about pressurized water reactors for atomic power. It will not be cheap to operate. It will be no cheaper to operate than Wright's Kitty Hawk would have been to carry passengers around. At the present time, reactor design is an art. It's not a science. We are trying to make a science out of it.
Shippingport's thorium fuel load was a proof of concept, and not an economic breeder design. At Oak Ridge, Wigner saw molten salt as a way of economically breeding natural thorium into uranium-233. At Argonne, Fermi saw liquid metal as a way of economically breeding natural uranium into plutonium.
Both uranium and plutonium can be and are, of course, peacefully used and alleviate a great deal of human suffering, but I must admit there is that lingering notion of how they were used terribly in weapons at one time that does make it difficult for the public to sort of accept forms of energy that had that connection. And thorium, fortunately, was never employed in that manner, and so probably has a neutral feeling in most people's minds. They don't really have an opinion one way or another about thorium any more than they might about dysprosium or something else on the periodic table.
9. Well, this was wartime. Their plan was to make bombs. They took natural uranium and they separated those 2 isotopes. They would highly enrich uranium-235 from less than 1% up to like 90+%. Took big factories. It's very difficult to do isotopic enrichment. But this is how they made the uranium for the first nuclear weapon used in war. This was the bomb at Hiroshima. It was called Little Boy. Then they said, well, what can we do with all this junk uranium-238, the 99.3% of it? You could expose it to neutrons, and you could make it into plutonium. Now, plutonium is a different chemical element than uranium, so they can be chemically separated. Uranium-235, uranium-238 are like identical chemically. There's no chemical difference between them. But there is a chemical difference between plutonium and uranium, so it was a lot easier to do a chemical separation of the plutonium you'd made, and that's how they made the Nagasaki bomb, which was called Fat Man. Okay, well maybe we can do the same thing with thorium. Maybe we can expose it to neutrons and we can make it into uranium-233. Uranium will be chemically separable from thorium and we can go make a bomb out of it, right? Sounds great. It's a really bad idea because as you made the uranium-233, you were always making uranium-232. You didn't make a lot of it, you only made a little bit of it. But uranium-232 is much more radioactive than uranium-233. Here's the decay chain that uranium-232 is on. It jumps down to bismuth-212 and thallium-208. And these two decay products put out very, very strong gamma rays. And these gamma rays are just super bad news if you want to go and build a practical nuclear device, because they tell everybody where the stuff is and they kill you. So really quickly they were going, okay, we can work with uranium-235, that seems okay. We can work with plutonium, that seems okay. But this uranium-233 stuff, that's bad news for making a nuclear weapon. So thorium was just set aside.
PG-13.
Well, after the war, they picked up on this again because now they were thinking, let's talk about making power instead of making nuclear weapons. And so what happened is they put resources into the plutonium breeder reactor almost from the get-go. They built the experimental breeder reactor 1 in 1951. So this was the first reactor that made electricity. 4 little light bulbs here. This was a breeder reactor. It was designed to convert plutonium into energy while making new plutonium. This was not a light water reactor. This predated the light water reactor by years. Early nuclear pioneers like Enrico Fermi and Eugene Wigner saw the future quite a bit differently. Fermi believed that we should really focus our efforts on the fast breeder reactor. Eugene Wigner, on the other hand, reached a different conclusion, which was that thorium was a superior fuel. And this opened up a number of possibilities with coolants and reactor configurations. They, by and large, said, we're going to go the plutonium route. And one of the reasons why was they had developed a great deal of understanding about plutonium from the weapons program. They had made the stuff. They had worked with its chemistry. They'd made fuel out of it. They go, we get this. Thorium, we haven't really messed with thorium. You know, it would be like starting over. So that propensity there was to go and do what you already knew how to do. And the plutonium was so much better developed than the thorium.
Because the liquid metal fast breeder uses liquid sodium as coolant, and because sodium has a higher boiling point than water at atmospheric pressure, the coolant in a liquid metal fast breeder does not need to be pressurized.
Pressurized water reactors are really thick pipe, whereas here it's relatively thin pipe.
Both types of breeder reactors, the liquid metal fast breeder and the molten salt breeder, can avoid the cost and complexity associated with containing pressurized water coolant, which may flash to steam. However, the chemical stability of molten salt coolant and the ability of molten salt to secure radioactive isotopes within strong chemical bonds is not shared by sodium.
It's stored under an oil to stop air or moisture getting on it. Reacts very, very quickly with air and also with water. Well, the hydroxide is a white crust on the outside.
All right, go.
Oh, jeez. Catches on fire and then it explodes.
They built a reactor and put it in a sub, and they ended up cutting the reactor out of the sub and putting a LWR in it.
But they became disenchanted with sodium cooling rather quickly.
What happens if there's a leak? Sodium reacts with the air and the water.
Well, you haven't got air next door to your sodium surfaces. It's inerted.
With liquid metal fast breeders, the advantage of a coolant operating near atmospheric pressure must be weighed against the use of that same coolant, which also reacts rapidly to air at high temperature and violently to water at any temperature.
Milt Shaw wanted Alvin Weinberg and Oak Ridge to get on the fast breeder funding wagon, and that Weinberg wanted to stay on with thorium and molten salt.
Well, it was pretty obvious that Shaw was completely convinced LMFBR, with its sodium-cooled system, was going to be successful. If we have a winner here, why spend money on what we know is going to be the loser?
This breeding principle holds the key to the efficient use of our atomic fuel resources of uranium and thorium. This atomic power plant in Michigan is named after Enrico Fermi, a breeder type of reactor. Great amounts of research and testing go into the designing and construction to make them efficient and, above all, to make them safe.
Breeder reactor has taken on a strongly negative connotation. In 1966, a liquid metal breeder reactor suffered a meltdown. This incident led to the book and song, We Almost Lost Detroit. However, in 1986, 20 years after the accident, another liquid metal breeder reactor, running at full power, underwent a controlled system blackout.
We took EBR2 to 100% power and we gagged the safety system so the emergency control rods would not go in if they were told to. And then we turned off the main coolant pumps.
And you pulled on your helmets.
Well, it sounds dangerous, but it wasn't.
No control rods were inserted. No human intervention was involved. They just turned off the pumps and waited. The temperature climbed, held, and then began to drop.
The core tends to expand thermally a little bit as it heats up.
The fuel expands, the clad expands, the core support structure expands, the core plate underneath expands.
And now more neutrons leak out and don't contribute to the chain reaction. And now there's natural circulation going on inside this big vessel. We can design it so that natural air circulation on the outside would occur, so you would actually never ever need to take operator action.
The trouble is these tests were done about 2 weeks before Chernobyl.
Yes, that's right. That was
so no one even knew about this, which was a shame. Bob.
This was not commercialized, right?
We were going to, it was called Clinch River. I was working on Clinch River, and then
we're eliminating programs that are no longer needed, such as nuclear power research and development.
This administration does not support the Department of Energy's Advanced Liquid Metal Reactor program and will oppose any efforts to continue the funding for this reactor project.
In 1994, during the Clinton administration, the last American breeder reactor program was canceled.
This is not a dream. This is real. We know how to do these things.
Nobody saw the light water reactor as the machine on which we would power our civilization using nuclear power for thousands of years. The only question is which breeder and how fast do we get to it? I mean, I got a 1962 report to the president, and right in there it states this is a stopgap technology. I think these early nuclear pioneers would be absolutely floored to show up today in our nuclear world and go, oh my gosh, you're still using light water reactors? I mean, come on, guys. We should have seen more technology advancement by now. We should have seen something better.
Successful breeder reactor tests have never been publicly celebrated.
The advantages outweigh the difficulties. You can handle this molten salt reliably, and when things go wrong, we were able to fix. The concept is ultimately going to be practical application.
Canceled, plutonium, and meltdown would be the words most commonly associated with breeder reactor.
Pandora's Promise came out and they're talking about the fast reactor. Is there any uptick in interest in this now?
I think it has motivated some people who had been either skeptical of nuclear or were anti-nuclear to rethink.
So I'm Robert Stone. I'm the director of Pandora's Promise, which is a documentary that chronicles the conversion of a number of high-profile environmentalists from being anti-nuclear to pro-nuclear, and their process of conversion on this issue very much mirrors my own.
On opening night, I polled the audience. I was surprised that 20% actually admitted to being pro-nuclear at Sundance, but they raised their hands, Q&A after the film, and I asked the same question, and that was the response.
Until Pandora's Promise in 2013, there was no compelling video explanation of the liquid metal reactor's safety test for the public to digest. That same year, a video of molten salt researchers was posted to YouTube explaining how the molten salt reactor experiment safely compensated for an equipment malfunction thanks to the passive safety enabled by molten salt.
Molten salt is inherently safe and, self-controlling.
Just about any molten salt concept that has been seriously considered has been shown to have this stable behavior.
This is an old facility. Look down before you walk. That's our biggest hazard here right now.
Oh my goodness. Yes.
Yes. I've modeled this shape neutronically.
It is like a lead pencil, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
Basically.
We just returned from a trip to Oak Ridge National Laboratories, and one of the exciting things that the Baroness and I got to do was to tour the Molten Salt Reactor experiment, which was one of these type of reactors that was built in the 1960s.
Decades ago, we successfully demonstrated passive safety features of the competing breeder reactors.
We took EBR2 to 100% power, then we turned off the main coolant pumps.
The fuel expands, the clad expands.
And now more neutrons leak out and don't contribute to the chain reaction.
Safety is one of the most important reasons to consider very seriously molten salt reactors. And this is because of the clever implementation that was demonstrated in the molten salt reactor experiment. A small port in the bottom of the reactor that was kept plugged. And to keep the port plugged, they had a blower that would blow cool gas over it. So there was a little plug of frozen salt there. Well, if the power went out, the blower turned off, and the heat would melt the frozen plug, and guess what? Psh, everything would drain out of the reactor into this drain tank, and the difference between the drain tank and the reactor vessel was the reactor vessel was not meant to lose any thermal energy. The only place you wanted to lose thermal energy was to give it up in the primary heat exchanger. The drain tank, on the other hand, is designed to maximize the rejection of thermal energy to the environment. I'm a mechanical engineer, so all we ever talked about in school was how to, add heat to things and take heat out of things. And one of the hard things about designing a nuclear reactor is design it to not lose any heat while you're running it, because you don't want all that heat to go over to the steam turbine. You don't want to lose a bunch of heat in normal operation, but then to turn around and try to keep it cool if something goes wrong. So there are two conflicting things. The great thing about liquid fluoride reactors is you can design them completely separately. You can say, here's my reactor and it's designed to make heat, and here's my drain tank and it's designed to cool in all situations.
Decades ago, we turned naturally abundant isotopes of uranium and thorium into energy. Shipping Port, a light water breeder, was captured on film. The liquid metal fast breeders were also captured on film.
And when you present that to somebody who's been anti-nuclear their whole life, they go, huh? Did you know that? And it's like, no, I never knew that. People say, I never knew that. And they think, that's why thorium, do you know that you could power a reactor with thorium? They go, what's that?
Clearly, someone also shot film footage of Glenn Seaborg standing in front of the molten salt reactor discussing the thorium fuel cycle. I cannot find this film. I cannot show you any film footage of an operating molten salt reactor. Only a handful of pictures exist. It's like NASA landed a man on the moon and then lost the film. This makes for an interesting communications challenge.
I was driving home from work in April of 2006, and I was listening to a piece on the radio from NPR, and it was talking about the importance of proper branding, and that M was a bad sound, M. It was kind of they were saying that L was one of the best sounds and M was one of the worst sounds. So I'm sitting there thinking about the MSBR, the Molten Salt Breeder Reactor, and I thought, molten, bad, salt, bad. I thought, how can we fix this? Well, instead of saying molten, we could say liquid, because it is liquid, and liquid turns an M to an L, and according to this, L was a lot better letter than an M. There are a lot of different kind of salts. So if we were more specific on the salt, we could say fluoride, which is a salt. It's a particular kind of salt. Breeder is a kind of generic term, and what we're really doing is we're using thorium as a fuel. So all of a sudden, there it was, LFTR. And one of the things I learned at NASA was you really want your acronyms to be sayable. And if they have more than 3 letters, you want to be able to say them like a word. And it was like it just appeared. There it was, LFTR, lifter. You could say it. It was a word.
I mean, as a marketing student, I have a lot different approach, but I still get excited.
Hey, you know what? We need guys just like you. Any other marketing students here? I mean, this, there's almost a branding effort that needs to happen. How do you tell a story saying this is different? I used to think when I was y'all's age, I was an aerospace engineer. I didn't know anything about nuclear. I thought nuclear power was dumb. I had no interest in it. I was like, old junk. Who would want to be into that? It wasn't until I learned about thorium and I realized these efficiencies were possible that I began getting really interested. Don't do new Coke, but what do you do? How do you help people understand that there really are alternative possibilities out there? We need guys like you thinking about this.
You can come to one of the conferences, talk to your friends about it, tell people about it. I mean, the biggest problem we have is getting the message out. And a guy got on yesterday and he said, why don't we go buy a full-page ad? And I said, because that costs a lot of money. Why don't you just go tell 5 of your friends about it? It doesn't cost you anything. And it's probably a whole lot more effective than getting an ad in the newspaper.
It was only developed at Oak Ridge, so no other national laboratories really participated in this development, which is not true about about most other types of reactors where the effort was sort of spread and many people participated. This was really only in the Oak Ridge before the age of internet. I think it was sometime in 2006 when I discovered Kirk's site, energy from thorium, and learned about the molten salt reactors.
Kirk Sorensen, he is what brought molten salts to the fore. It's pretty much all been on his shoulders, and he should be lauded for that. It's outstanding what he's done.
Kirk gave me some CDs, and then he put them on the internet. And of course, to me, that was a game changer. That was an inflection point. Before, I sounded like a nut. And I couldn't point, unless you were physically with me, and I could bring down, I have a copy of Fluid Fuel Reactors showing the Molten Salt Reactor in it, and the aircraft reactor experiment. Matter of fact, it has a picture, and in the background is a step ladder. It shows you the scale. It was half the size of your refrigerator, and it put out 2 million watts of heat. And it operated in 1954. I wasn't even on the planet then.
We can have world peace, and we can specialize in what areas that we're good at, and trade with one another, and not fight over limited resources.
There's some chemical differences between thorium and uranium. Leached by water, U compounds were widely dispersed, and having been scattered far and wide, U compounds today are found as complex, generally dilute deposits containing mixtures of tetra, penta, and hexavalent uranium. Unlike uranium, tetravalent thorium, and is constantly tetravalent, resists weathering. Thorium thus remained concentrated where it first wound up, within easy reach.
Barack Obama, and I've heard other people say this before, they say that there's no silver bullet to the energy crisis.
Molten salts are truly the best silver bullet for serving mankind. Is it unlocks thorium economically, and as we know, thorium is so plentiful in the Earth's crust, come as a byproduct for hundreds of thousands of years. And in fact, if we on purpose wanted to mine the granite just for its thorium, we're not going to run out until the sun becomes red giant.
Alvin Weinberg called it burning the rocks.
You could literally mine rock just for its energy content.
Glenn Seaborg realized this in 1944, and he was absolutely dumbfounded with the possibilities of what it meant for the future.
The Molten Salt Reactor experiment has operated successfully and has earned a reputation for reliability. I think that someday the world will have commercial power reactors of both the uranium, plutonium, and the thorium, uranium fuel cycle types.
Here he was watching nations wage war against one another in World War II and realizing that this could be a complete game changer and change the entire energy outlook of the future.
EFT bloggers noticed that all these guys from China, from graduate school and computer modelers started showing up on EFT, signing up from Shanghai, Beijing, and they started asking all these, obvious questions about this and that and how to make the code work. And they were all modeling at the Chinese government expense, so we could tell.
Did you say China is building nuclear reactors with their tickets? So where are they getting the blueprints? Are they developing a network?
Well, I mean, they probably got a whole bunch of stuff, the PDFs from my website.
Have you gone through your logs and see how many are coming from China?
It's been in the public domain for an awful long time. I just made it a little easier to get,
China announced to their national press of the existence of a well-funded molten salt reactor project.
And it's being run by a guy named Jiangming Heng. He got his PhD in electrical engineering from Drexel University. He was educated in the United States. The really interesting thing about Dr. Zhang is that his father's name is Jiang Zemin, and he used to be the premier of China. So when I found that out, I thought, this is not some schmo here. This is somebody who's probably got some resources behind him. And if he says he's going to go build a thorium molten salt reactor, well, I tend to think he's probably going to do it. So ever since finding that out, I've been really encouraging people in the United States and England and Canada and Japan and just about anywhere. I said, it really would be a good idea if maybe we got going on this, because these guys are probably going to pull it off. And, good, I hope they do. China definitely needs clean energy, absolutely. And thorium will provide them clean energy for hundreds of thousands of years. But frankly, I'd really like us to be able to do it too. And I'd like it to be something maybe that we developed rather than that we go buy. We buy a lot of things from China already. You know, I mean, it's not as if we're not buying enough things from China. We are definitely keeping them busy. So let's go develop thorium. And that's really what I'd like to do.
You know, one of the fun things about being mayor is that you come to the science fair to see the projects of some people that are close to you, and the next thing you know, you're standing on stage in front of 1,000 people. It tends to happen.
Hi, I'm Joe Willis, and this is my science fair project, Decarbonize Alberta, and this is just a dry run for science fair, which is in a week.
What is this? You've brainwashed your son into being a proponent of the nuclear industry. Why? No. Why, man? Why?
It's the other way around, actually. I was the first critic.
Joe Willis for Decarbonize Alberta.
Wait, what? That's me? I got a thorium documentary, and I watched it with my dad, and naturally he fell asleep through the entire thing. And I'm telling him how thorium could save the world, and he's not agreeing with me at all. So I put it in the second time, and he falls asleep. Yeah, I got the gold medal. I got the second Consumer Science Award, and the American Society of Heating, Refrigeration, and Air Conditioning. And although that one's name sounds like something for air conditioning, it's for air quality.
I try to portray science as exciting and fun with Katie and Casey science videos. Casey is my miniature poodle. She's 3 years old. I thought that if we adopted the lifter, then we would have a much better future. If we educate people, then they will understand nuclear power, and then they may become more supportive.
You need this stuff explained in layman's terms so the average Joe on the street gets it the way the average Joe on the street gets the basic beats of an internal combustion engine.
They made an information package that they tried to be relatively neutral to give to people and then ask their opinion on nuclear power. People were, I'm not really opposed, I'm not hugely in favor. When they did focus groups where they brought 12 people in, gave them the same information, and then left the room and let them talk, then went back, pulled the people apart anonymously, the approval ratings were amazing. Probably you at least get one or two people that knows enough that the other people trust that can explain it to them. So if we can explain it better to the public, I think that'll go a long way.
For me, I think it's education at all levels. We talked about on the board educating candidates and people in political office, but I think there's also the general public, make them aware of what's possible and get them interested in the sciences at the lower ages and say, yes, I want to be working on something that can power the world in the future.
In addition to being an engineer, he really is an educator. He really is a teacher. And he was beginning to spend more and more and more time mostly educating.
This is laws of physics stuff. I didn't invent it. All I do is promote it.
He got a phone call from a stranger and spent probably 45 minutes on the phone really being patient with the specifics and tapping my watch.
We need to start today to get young people interested in this area. The molten salt chemistry, the metallurgy, the radiochemistry, even the civil engineering. We have to start that supply chain almost from scratch.
Are there labs going to be integrated into this curriculum, or is there any way to leave those out? Because I know that that was really the biggest challenge, getting the supplies to develop a lab for our curriculum.
But still, any molten salt is going to require a furnace of some type.
Most of the nuclear engineering schools have lost their operating reactors in the last 20 years. So they're teaching, it'd be like teaching how to work on a car with a shop manual, but no car, you know? So there's students learning how to run nuclear reactors with nothing to learn on, just sort of reading about it. China has built a huge network of training reactors. They did it in like a couple of years. We did a journey to just about every nuclear engineering school, and we said, how would you like to have the salt loop? It would just be externally heated. It wouldn't be fueled, so it couldn't generate its own heat. But in every other conceivable way, especially if you had neutronic stand-ins, it would act exactly like a molten salt reactor would.
You can show the scientific phenomena, the chemical and physical phenomena, but without
breaking the bank.
Would that be utilized by other departments as well?
Absolutely. You need an XRD, basically to look at the crystal pre and post, and those types of equipment span the gamut from biological sciences to geosciences, engineering.
If they're going to have a training reactor, they might as well have a Gen 4 training reactor, not a Gen 1. I mean, that's what they have now down at U of I that's being dismantled. MIT and Harvard, even they can't afford to build like their own telescope anymore just by themselves. So Harvard and Berkeley and University of Chicago and MIT get together and they all say, oh, we'll pitch in and we'll share it.
So, you got all these people excited now.
I hope so. Is everybody excited?
Salt reactor. Well, plus you mentioned nuclear. To anyone in their initial reaction is nuclear energy. Oh, there's no way we could learn this stuff. I don't want to do that class. It's going to be too hard.
I was really encouraged by in the Chicago meeting we were at. There was a number of young kids that were there. And I mean, like, I suppose I don't mean kids, I mean like college age.
And how knowledgeable they were.
And how enthusiastic. And, that kind of gives me hope.
And I can tell you that is not going on in the conventional nuclear industry. We haven't produced very many nuclear engineers. I taught a class of senior level engineer students at Tennessee Tech in the fall of 2010, and there were 13 in the class. And, they didn't even have nuclear engineering at Tennessee Tech. These were all mechanicals, electricals, chemicals. 5 of them went on to grad school in nuclear engineering because of my course. I wanted to write the NRC and say, you've told them the best situation you can possibly have is to be part of a massive decommissioning contract. I mean, how many people want to spend their careers doing that?
When a nation dreams big and has fully funded projects, visible to everyone, where a frontier is getting advanced daily, innovations attract smart, clever people. The prospect of innovation attracts them. Everyone feels like tomorrow is something they want to invent and bring into the present.
You guys should elect an engineer president.
That's what Chinese do. All our political leaders are lawyers, and all of China's political leaders are engineers. So, oh gosh.
We're going broke. We're mired in debt. We don't have as many scientists as we want or need, and jobs are going overseas. I assert that these are not isolated problems, that they're the collective consequence of the absence of ambition that consumes you when you stop having dreams. If all you do is coast, eventually you slow down while others catch up and pass you by.
Why nuclear energy? Especially after what happened in Japan. And why Molten Salt Reactor? And why Thorium? And last but not the least, why China is the first one to eat the crab? That's Chinese saying.
The Chinese Academy of Sciences has begun an effort to develop what they call TMSR, Thorium Molten Salt Reactor. And it's really along these same lines. And they are well funded and well staffed.
300 people working full-time on it.
They know that those are the same people who are going to turn around and operate and maintain those reactors. I give them great credit.
It's very compelling work. Chinese are definitely in the lead right now on this.
In 1994, the state of California passed a law of the zero emissions. And GM's EV1 came out in 1996 because they very much like to catch the market of the California. The big oils heavily lobbying East Coast not to follow the same track as California did. Finally, GM called back all the EV1s from the market and crashed them in 2004. It's something to me like World War II NAS. It's amazing. It's very scary story here. Here is pure electrical car developed by Chinese Academy of Sciences. We used to have a dream, if we can produce a clean electricity, then we can drive our electrical car. However, if you look at this, as of today, it's all gasoline cars. So it makes our job even impossible. We need a revolutionary something happen. Why thorium? And why MSR? Low pressure here, which gives you more safety, we also end up with the high temperature here. We need high temperature. Because if you can go 900 degrees C, then we can use this energy to convert the CO2, which is not the waste at all. Is a raw material for our chemicals. In fact, we need the energy to convert them. We need the high temperature.
There's all sorts of very, very interesting chemistry that we have actually never even been able to have the opportunity to look at because we've never had a cheap energy platform at those temperatures. With a heat platform like a molten salt reactor, you can do any number of high temperature reactions.
We're still going to need liquid fuels for vehicles and machinery, but we could generate these liquid fuels from the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and from water, much like nature does. We could generate hydrogen by splitting water and combining it with carbon harvested from CO2 in the atmosphere, making fuels like methanol, ammonia, and dimethyl ether, which could be a direct replacement for diesel fuels.
The whole planet's transportation system is gauged toward the consumption of a fossil fuel. There's an entire internal combustion infrastructure on the planet.
Imagine carbon neutral gasoline and diesel, sustainable and self-produced.
A way of getting the full life cycle out of the infrastructure we've already built up. Because you don't want to just abandon the infrastructure we've already built up. We have trillions of dollars of internal combustion engine machinery around, but we need to at least stop putting more stuff in the air.
The opportunities abound. I couldn't even tell you. There's so many possibilities. I wouldn't even want to predict. Wouldn't even want to.
All right, so this is the work that's actually going on at NRL today. This is not a theoretical possibility. The ocean, or rivers as it's pointed out, is full of carbon dioxide and hydrogen. There's lots of this everywhere on the planet. In fact, 7/10 of the Earth's surface is covered with water. We were looking at here at the electrolytic cation exchange module. This is on version 3. Here's the skid that's used down at Naval Air Station Key West. And what's going on is pretty simple. We're pumping electricity into this module up here. We're pulling carbonic acid, HCO3, out of the water. And by the way, per unit gallon, we're getting about a 92% removal from it. And then we're using standard electrolysis to crack water in order to make hydrogen. And what do you do with it? You string the carbon together with your hydrogen, and let's get into the fuels business. Here is the spectrum for JP5, which is the standard fuel used to run all the aircraft, a bit like a classic bell curve. And what you're seeing is the spectrum based upon carbon content of the individual hydrocarbons as you make this guy out of oil. So this is anybody, Exxon, BP, Shell, whoever you want to name it, pulling petroleum out of the ground, fractionally distilling it, and making JP5 according to the mil spec. So what happens coming out of our machine down at Naval Air Station Key West? Well, now look at this. We've got a decay curve. Because we're manufacturing the fuel synthetically, we're able to control the carbon content and get a better concentration of the C10 hydrocarbons that we want than you can get from natural oil. So what this turns out is that the synthetically made aviation fuel actually has a higher energy density and is cleaner. It doesn't have the sulfur compounds in it, doesn't have the nitrates in it. All of the other really nasty stuff that comes out of burning a fossil fuel we don't have, and we have a better power density profile, making this stuff artificially. If you do just basic high school chemistry, if we can get hydrogen and CO2 from seawater, you have the fundamental building blocks right there for making any hydrocarbon fuel you want. Burn the fuel, it'll go into the air, it'll get absorbed in the ocean, pulled out of the ocean, turned into the fuel, burned and back into the air. So your car works beautifully just as today, but it's not running on oil, but it's still running the same fuel you have today. It's not a real airplane, I admit it. However, you're looking at it in the air, flying on fuel that was made from seawater and electricity. What do you do about civilian aviation? Are we going to move to a world where only the highest of our elected officials fly around the world and the rest of us get to walk? Because there is no substitute for aviation fuel if you want to get in the air. We're not going to have solar-powered aircraft. We're not going to have hydrogen fuel-powered aircraft anytime soon. We're looking at some total radical technology breakthrough if you want to fly. The hydrocarbonic acid in the ocean is in equilibrium with the CO2 in the atmosphere. It's a very simple test. Seal up a fish tank, fill salt water in the bottom, don't let any air into it. Run your probes in there, pull carbonic acid out of the bottom, read your CO2 level in the air above it, and watch the CO2 level in the atmosphere drop. Every time you take a piece of carbon out of the ocean, it is the same as taking it out of the atmosphere. It will pass from the air into the water. So when you send an aircraft up in the air and it's running on fuel you made by taking carbonic acid out of the ocean, you have a virtual carbon cycle. You are not adding CO2 at all. It's carbon-free fuel that is carbon and burns in our existing engines.
So what we're going to do is go through the various stages that will be needed to make fuel on the Martian surface. I've taken a tray full of ice and covered it in sand to represent the Martian geology. There's ice caps at the top, and this is solid ice, water, and also solid carbon dioxide. We can drill down to get this solid ice and turn it into liquid. Take a screwdriver, heat it up, and melt this ice by burrowing through our Martian surface that we've got here, turn frozen water into liquid water and steam. Now we can use electricity to pull the hydrogen and the oxygen apart by simply dropping a 9-volt battery into our bowl of water. On the negative terminal, which is the fatter terminal, you see bubbles forming, and that's hydrogen gas being formed out of the water.
Did Lewis and Clark cross the American continent, bringing with them all the food, water, and air they would need for themselves and their horses for a 3-year transcontinental trip of exploration? No. If they had done that, they would have needed a wagon train of supplies for every man and another wagon train for every horse. And then, of course, the wagon train men and horses would have needed further wagon trains, and it would have gone exponential. If you looked at these other mission plans, what you saw was that the majority of the mass that they were sending to Mars was the propellant to come back. What is the travel light and live off the land approach to Mars exploration? This is a little rocket ship for returning from Mars to Earth in the terminal stage of the mission, but no one's in it when it goes out the first time. They have to be unfueled, or this would weigh much too heavy to throw to Mars. And then slung below the vehicle, not shown in this diagram, is a little truck. In the back of that truck is a little nuclear reactor. You take the water, you electrolyze it, split it into hydrogen and oxygen, and you suck in the Martian air, which is 95% carbon dioxide. And now you've got a fully fueled Earth return vehicle sitting waiting for you on the surface of Mars. But it wouldn't be practical if you had to bring the fuel from Earth. And in fact, we make extra propellant beyond what the Earth return vehicle needs so that we can operate chemical-powered vehicles on the surface of Mars for exploration purposes. But the ability to make use of local resources is not just the key to making the mission cheap, it's also the key to making the mission effective, because there's no point going to Mars unless you can do something useful once you get there.
Constellation program was the program that NASA had started to put people back on the moon, and I had been working on it for a number of years. It was good that it got canceled. It was a program that was in really big trouble. It was way over budget. It was poorly designed. It was being very poorly implemented. But I was there with a colleague, and she did trajectory work like I did, and I said, "Well, are you disappointed this has been canceled?" I'll never forget what she said to me. She said, "Kirk, I've been here 30 years. Every single thing I've ever worked on has been canceled."
The old strategy, including the Constellation program, was not fulfilling its promise in many ways. That's not just my assessment.
And there is a parallel there, I think, between what's going on in the nuclear industry and what's going on at NASA.
So it sounds like you each worked on a number of different reactors over your careers.
Everything I ever worked on got canceled.
Not because of him, though.
The shuttle was a magnificent technology development in 1981. Part of the problem was the U.S. held on to the shuttle for 30 years, and in 2011, the shuttle was not such a magnificent technology development anymore because NASA kept holding on to the old technology until finally President Bush had to say, we're going to stop doing it.
The space shuttle, after nearly 30 years of duty, will be retired from service.
And I think there's a parallel there with the light water reactor. We built 100 some odd light water reactors between the 70s and the 80s and a few into the 90s. And as you've seen from our visit to Oak Ridge, there's talk about extending those reactors 60 and 80 years. And you get into the same sort of argument of diminishing returns. How long do you hold on to the old technology?
I don't see the trajectory as serving any purpose
because there are processing disadvantages, there are engineering disadvantages, there are material science disadvantages. All of those things are non-issues if you adopt a truly fluid fuel/cooling system, whether you're in space or on the moon or on Mars. You need something that is basically stupid-proof, right? It's idiot-proof. And all of the redundancy that is involved in solid fuel reactors is basically eliminated.
Desalinating briny water. Synthesizing liquid fuel. Growing indoor crops. These are how humans can reduce our ecological footprint here on Earth and explore Mars without breaking the bank. In all environments, on Earth and in zero gravity, we want reactors capable of producing large amounts of power, yet are simple and compact. On Earth, small reactors can be transported by train, by truck, or by ship. Factory construction is much cheaper than on-site construction. A small reactor also requires less natural resources to fabricate in the first place. Size is even more important for off-world application because launching stuff into space is so incredibly expensive. We don't want any complex mechanism for shuttling around solid fuel. Much operational complexity takes place outside a nuclear reactor. The enrichment of uranium, the management of spent fuel. Overall, molten salt reactors are much simpler. The greater efficiency enabled by liquid homogeneity means less mining and less waste per kilowatt hour generated. Unlike today's solid fuel reactors, which can only be economically fueled with uranium, it is possible to fuel an appropriately designed molten salt reactor economically with thorium.
Almost all of it will ultimately end up fissioning. Out of about 1,000 kilograms, about 15 kilograms of plutonium-238 will be left over. Now this is good stuff. Plutonium-238 is different than plutonium-239, the stuff we use in bombs. In fact, it's worthless for bombs. This is the stuff NASA uses in its deep space batteries. Voyager, Galileo, Cassini, New Horizons, all of these deep space probes. Almost everything that comes out of this reactor can be sold for product. And then it'll make enough uranium-233 to replace itself from 1,000 kilograms of thorium.
Breeding thorium requires a more complicated design than is required for a uranium-fueled molten salt reactor. The question becomes, do you only want the reactor to be as simple as possible? Or do you want the entire fuel life cycle to be as simple and efficient as possible? In space, for most applications, we absolutely need our reactor to be as simple as possible. A smaller, lighter reactor is of the utmost importance for our immediate exploration needs. The first molten salt reactor launched into space will undoubtedly be powered by uranium, not thorium. But eventually, we want to maximize the efficiency with which we consume natural resources. On Earth, we do this because we don't like digging big holes over here and dumping big piles over there. On the Moon and Mars, we might not worry about pollution, but we'd be far more constrained in how we harvest natural resources. Thorium is an element found everywhere. It is junk. Rare earth mining operations would just as soon pay you to take it off their hands.
If you're pulling out rare earths and your deposit has, let's say, 8% rare earths, it may have 14% thorium.
Every known way to extract rare earths from their mineral concentrates, thorium just literally drops out like a rock and you have it. The thorium is free. So it's going to be the most valuable commodity in the world with almost no value.
Because the element thorium can be isolated with basic chemistry, and because molten salt reactors do not require solid fuel fabrication, it is possible to mine dirt for energy even on the Moon and on Mars.
One amazing application of molten salt reactors is to solve the water problem. We're standing in Palo Alto, California, in Silicon Valley, and they are in the midst of one of the worst droughts in California history. Well, solve the water problem by reverse osmotic desalination of all that water that we have offshore here, then make very environmentally friendly fertilizers, because you're doing zero emission energy source, and then solve the food problem. And you can apply that model worldwide.
Any factory-assembled advanced reactor brought to market could help make nuclear power safer and less expensive. But it is liquid-fueled thorium reactors which can completely decouple energy generation from negative environmental impact. Lifter consumes only the unwanted byproduct of existing mining operations.
There's so much rare earths that we're throwing away because of thorium.
One rare earth, and usually one thorium atom.
We could solve the rare earth problem without opening any new mines, and we can solve the energy problem without mining either.
We need the thorium, and he needs somebody to get rid of the thorium.
I realized that there was 60 people sitting on the other side of the podium going, do you think there's enough of it? Do you think there's a stable supply?
How much thorium do you think you'll be pulling up a year in your rare earth mine? He goes, I think about 5,000 tons. He goes, is that a lot? I said, well, by my calculations, 5,000 tons of thorium would supply the planet with all of its energy for a year. I said, so your one mine in Missouri would bring up enough thorium without even trying to power the entire planet. He goes, and there's like a zillion other places on Earth that are just like my mine. I mean, it's a nice mine, but it's not unique. It's not like this is the one place on Earth where this is found.
The promise of abundant clean energy has already been made by wind and solar advocates. However, those are diffuse and intermittent sources of energy. Thorium, when consumed in a molten salt reactor, is incredibly energy dense. And thorium in a molten salt reactor can follow energy demand.
We did it at a number of different power levels.
You could change the load on this radiator by moving the doors down, and the reactor would follow the load.
As the salt would heat up, there would be less fissile material in the nuclear reactor core, and so fission became less likely. Conversely, as the salt cooled down, there was more material because the salt was contracting, and fission became more likely. An inherently stable system. In other words, gets hotter, cools down, gets too cool, heats up. So that is a really amazing quality that a nuclear reactor can have, and this reactor had in spades. And then you have other things like wind and solar where you can't change the rate at which it's coming at all. You just take whatever you're going to get.
We have to get beyond burning stuff for energy, and we can go to a dispersed form of energy, which is gathering wind and solar, or we can go to a more concentrated form of energy, which is nuclear. And the disadvantage of wind and solar that will always exist is the amount of labor, energy, and expense of gathering and concentrating and directing that energy, because energy has to be collected and directed to do work. And nuclear energy has already been collected.
Our national conversation on energy rarely mentions these concepts. Energy density, energy reliability. If we continue to ignore energy density and reliability, we'll wind up in a future like this one. A future where we continue to solve problems through ingenuity and perseverance, but always with a disadvantage. We won't be using energy to tackle problems if we've constrained our own access to it.
Human mechanical energy is so amazing. Why can't we use that to create energy? You will never run out of electricity. You never generate any pollution. So half the world is not going to generate pollution. We call it free electric.
Solar freaking roadways replaces all roadways, parking lots, sidewalks, driveways, tarmacs, bike paths, and outdoor recreation surfaces with smart microprocessing interlocking hexagonal solar units.
Maintaining a nation of solar highways, manufacturing bicycle battery generators for every home.
An extremely ambitious idea to replace our nation's roads with solar panels.
The Department of Transportation has kicked in $850,000. People are actually taking this seriously.
Despite the media attention they've received, I think these ideas are flat out crazy. But they're par for the course in today's energy landscape.
The Keystone XL pipeline extension.
For a while, the entire national energy discussion revolved around a single pipeline. Sometimes, it seems, the more difficult an energy source is to harness, the more attention it receives.
If you'll give me a chance to serve, I'll bring the EPA and the Agriculture Department and all the people together, and we'll use ethanol as a part of our nation's energy security future.
For example, corn ethanol receives $7 billion in subsidy each year. Corn ethanol's return on energy investment is 1.3 times. Only 30% more energy is recovered from corn ethanol than went into producing it.
Ethanol is a lousy molecule. I'm sorry, but the farm lobby did a really good job, because they had a lot of money, to be able to peddle a really grossly inferior molecule like ethanol. It's got 25% less energy density per mole than regular old gasoline. And it costs a hell of a lot more money per liter to make.
Even Al Gore, who was a key proponent of corn ethanol, acknowledges the subsidy was a mistake. The energy conversion ratios are, at best, very small. How does corn's 1.3 times compare against other energy sources? Solar cells return 7 times. Natural gas is 10 times. Wind is 18 times. Today's water-cooled nuclear is 80 times. Coal is 80 times. Hydropower is 100 times. A thorium-powered molten salt reactor can return 2,000 times the energy invested in it. As another point of reference, $7 billion is not just our yearly corn ethanol subsidy. It was also NASA's entire 2015 operating budget.
Personally, if I was going to try to be living on the moon or Mars, I would definitely want a nuclear power source. I would consider anything less to be tantamount to suicide.
There's lots of thorium on the surface of the moon. There's lots of thorium on the surface of Mars. There are fluorides on Mars, for certain. So you can actually get your fluorine source, your thorium source, your uranium source, and most likely the other metals that you would need.
Extract the water from the soils of Mars, separate the hydrogen and oxygen. We now have a supply of rocket fuel on Mars, a filling station, so you don't have to carry all your fuel with you.
There are many advantages to not having energy being your scarcest resource in space.
Set up some other nuclear reactor somewhere else in space. Space becomes that frontier. These innovations make headlines, and those headlines work their way down the educational pipeline, and everybody in school knows about it. You don't have to set up a program to convince people that being an engineer is cool.
This is a video about thorium, molten salt reactors, nuclear power, and energy itself. We look at technical challenges. We look at statements made which mischaracterize the potential of thorium. And we'll examine some claims that nuclear power is entirely unnecessary in the first place. This video exists because NASA spent $10,000 to digitize reactor research documents in 2004. The documents are public domain and can be accessed through Ornell's online library or Kirk's website. This is not mystery technology. Anyone can learn about molten salt reactors in great detail. In fact, half a dozen privately funded startups are working right now to bring modern, factory-assembled molten salt reactors to market.
The bug was put in my ear to think about a new company.
I worked 10 years on technology development at NASA. Technology doesn't develop on its own. It develops when we push it. And the converse is true. When we don't push technology, it doesn't go anywhere.
These reactors are designed to operate under 1 Earth gravity. They won't be small enough to launch into space. But unlike a space reactor, these molten salt reactors don't depend on NASA to fund development. In fact, The first molten salt reactor to ever operate was called the aircraft reactor experiment. It was incredibly compact, and it was designed to operate without gravity.
Unless you were physically with me and I could bring down fluid fuel reactors showing the molten salt reactor in it. And the aircraft reactor experiment, it was half the size of your refrigerator and it put out 2 million watts of heat.
They consciously and deliberately ignored the contribution of convection to heat flow in liquids. They ignored it. They ignored it for a very good reason. They were designing a nuclear reactor-powered bomber. It was going on an aeroplane. Aeroplanes do interesting things like go into dives, the force of gravity disappears, convection then stops. Convection is a gravity-driven phenomena, so they couldn't rely on convection.
NASA will be able to crib from the aircraft reactor experiment and an abundance of modern reactor designs to begin work on low-gravity or zero-gravity molten salt reactors. When molten salt reactors begin powering our cities and providing fresh water, it will be quickly recognized that the best bang for the buck ever attained by a government agency was the scanning of molten salt research performed by NASA for $10,000.
In the last third of this century, our independence will depend on self-sufficiency in energy. The United States will not be dependent on any other country for the energy we need to provide our jobs, to heat our homes, and to keep our transportation moving.
Beginning this moment, this nation will never use more foreign oil than we did in 1977. Never.
Our imports of foreign oil have been climbing steadily since 1985 and now stand at 42% of our total consumption.
We need a long-term energy strategy to maximize conservation and maximize the development of alternative sources of energy.
America is addicted to oil, often imported from unstable parts of the world. This country can dramatically improve our environment, move beyond a petroleum-based economy, and make our dependence on Middle Eastern oil a thing of the past.
In 10 years, we will finally end our dependence on oil from the Middle East.
Calls to action.
Calls to action. If you're at the age of 15 to 19, consider becoming a nuclear, chemical, electrical, or mechanical engineer. If you are from the ages of 20 to 25 and are not one of the aforementioned majors, consider going back to school.
Thank you.